You've likely heard the term missionary before, but what exactly does the term missionary mean? What is its definition? Because I think a lot of times there's a lot of ambiguity with it, and a lot of people, they have misconceptions on what exactly a missionary is. Now, most of the time people would say that a missionary is basically just someone who goes from their home country to another country to be a pastor. And generally speaking, that is the case, but it's not always the case. So for example, in this church, we help partially support about 50 different missionaries, and most of them are couples, and most of them are pastors. So that's generally true, that they are people who go from one country to another country to be a pastor, but that's not always true. So for example, like I said, most of them are couples that we support or help support, but some of them are single ladies, about 6 of them, I think. So with that in mind, how could these single ladies, who none of which are pastors, be considered missionaries? Well, I would take the definition of a missionary, instead of saying that it's just a person who goes from one country to another country to be a pastor, I would change that definition to be a little more broad, because I think that's a little too specific and not necessarily completely biblical. The Bible does talk about missionaries such as Paul going from one country to another country, but it was specifically the cultures that he was going to. So I would change the definition to say that a missionary is someone who leaves their original culture and starts a ministry or helps in a ministry in a foreign culture, a culture that is not their own, or a people group that is not their own. So Paul would definitely be considered a missionary because he did do that, right? Jesus made it very clear, God made it very clear from the very beginning when Paul was called to be a missionary. He says, this is going to be a minister to the Gentiles. Well, Paul wasn't a Gentile, he was a Jew. But God called him specifically to be a missionary to the Gentiles. He was still a missionary to the Jews, right? He still ministered to Jews. He still told the Jewish people about the gospel. And generally, whenever he went to a different city, he would generally go to the Jewish synagogues. But he would often go out of his way to talk to the Greeks, to talk to the Gentiles about the gospel, even though they were not part of his culture, because he was called to be a missionary to foreigners and to foreign cultures. So he did go from country to country, but he also preached in his own country, things like that. So yes, Paul was a missionary, but we also have to remember that Philip was a missionary. Philip was also a Jew. In fact, if you look, most of the early Christians were Jews. And Philip, after the Jerusalem church was being persecuted, after the Christians were being persecuted in Jerusalem, a lot of the Christians started to spread out and bring the gospel to other cities. And Philip was led to go to Samaria. And Samaria, if you know the history of Samaria, the Jewish people hated Samaria. Samaria, even though it was technically still within the borders of Israel, if you consider Israel and Judah to be one collective country, it was still within the borders of Israel, so it was still in the same country, but yet Philip went to these people, and these people were a different culture, they were a different people group. They were still technically Jewish in the sense that they were kind of a mixed breed. After Israel had been taken over many hundreds of years before that, the people started mixing, foreigners started mixing with the Jewish people, and eventually their descendants became a mixed breed as well as a mixed religion, because the foreigners brought their religion too, and they kind of mixed it with Judaism. So the Jewish people hated the Samaritans because they looked at them as a mixed breed and a mixed religion, and they kind of shunned them because of that. So when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, this was a shock to the Jewish people, his Jewish audience, because they're thinking, how can the Samaritans be good? They're a mixed religion and a mixed people. And then of course when Jesus talks to the woman at the well, the Samaritan at the well, his disciples, who were also Jewish, are very shocked that Jesus is talking to a Samaritan. But Philip, knowing that these people were hated by the Jews, knowing that these people were considered a different culture than the Jewish people, went to them and presented the gospel to them. So he didn't necessarily leave his country, but he left his culture and went to another culture and presented the gospel to them there. So I would consider a missionary to be someone who goes from one culture to another culture to present the gospel or to start a ministry there. Now Jesus has called all of us to follow the Great Commission, right? To go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. But our hometowns can be part of that world. So sometimes he's called us to be ministers in our hometown, to be witnesses in our hometown. But sometimes he's called people specifically to foreign countries, to foreign cultures, things like that. And the people who go from one culture to another culture to present the gospel, we would consider them to be missionaries.